Thank you, Karen, and thanks to everyone for coming along this morning. I wish we could see one another in person. However, we'll do our best to think and rethink this question of appeasement, its nature, and its role in the coming of the Second World War. I have quite a few slides, so probably we'll need to go relatively quickly, but what I want to emphasize to all of you at the very beginning is if there's one distinct, I suppose, new current or new perspective in the teaching of the origins of the Second World War, it's to think more systematically about that conflict as a part of dynamics that began in 1914 and perhaps earlier. And so there are, I suppose, roughly two ways of thinking about the coming of the Second World War. The first is to view it very much as part of what Donald Watt, Professor D.C. Watt, a kind of leading voice for decades on this question, called a 30 years civil war or a 30 years crisis. And that is to see both the Second World War as, if you like, almost inextricably linked from the First World War as part of the same dynamic, whether it's, I suppose, the two bids for German domination of Europe and perhaps even beyond Europe, or perhaps even, I suppose, the bloody end of Europe's position as the hub of world politics. And against that view are historians that would instead argue that, and within the former view rather, the Paris Peace Conference, the various peace treaties that emerged out of that conference, and in particular the Treaty of Versailles between the Allied associated powers and Germany, was a failed attempt to try and impose peace, either because it was fundamentally flawed as a settlement in and of itself, because it was either too punitive toward Germany or not punitive enough. A phrase made famous by the French historian and political commentator Jacques Banville when he said that it was trop dur pour ce qu'il y a de dur. It was too soft for that was in it that was harsh. In other words, it was neither one or the other. And now against this view of a 30 years crisis would be historians that argue that Europe did begin to recover, that in fact the bases were laid during the 1920s for a much more stable European and international system, but these were destroyed mainly by the impact of the Great Depression and the subsequent radicalization of politics across Europe, not just in either Italy or Germany, but instead even in some of the domestic politics of the status quo powers, and in particular, I suppose, France. So these are two different ways of looking at the coming of the war. Neither, I think, takes sufficient account for the role of the Soviet Union. And, Russia was one of the big powers, certainly one of the four most powerful states in 1914. It had been submerged in revolution from 1917 onward, but it had re-entered politics, as we'll discuss very briefly thereafter, and a fear of Russia, a fear of international Bolshevism, because of course the communist project was an international revolutionary project, did have an impact not only in the domestic politics of almost every European nation, perhaps even especially Germany, but also in their responses to the revisionist challenges of Germany and Italy. So I don't want to go go into great detail on Europe after the Great War, but these are slides that you can use if you find them useful. There was a new territorial settlement, the creation of what were called successor states to the Habsburg, Romanov, and Hohenzollern dynasties: Prussia, Germany, Imperial Russia, and Austria-Hungary. We'll talk about those in a moment. There was an economic and financial settlement which imposed an undisclosed amount of reparations on Germany in 1919 and 1921. In May 1921, the final sum of reparations was settled at 132 billion gold Reichsmarks, but that figure was really for public consumption. In fact, the only sum that the Germans were realistically expected to have to pay was about 55 billion Reichsmarks. And this was a sum roughly comparable, a little less than the indemnity imposed on France by Germany in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. There were hopes for the creation of a new world order at the Paris Peace Conference, the League of Nations, the concept of self-determination, that is, that people couldn't be traded around as they had been in the past when territories were pushed back and forth as part of peace settlements after wars. A permanent international court was established, the ILO was established, and there were committees and even departments within the League to deal with refugee and minority rights. There was also were also attempts to deal with the question of security, and in fact, the League was supposed to oversee efforts for arms limitations, which was thought to be an important way forward to the creation of a more durable peace. But there was big division within those who supported arms limitation between those who felt that it was necessary to disarm in order to have security. In other words, disarmament led to security. And those that argued instead that you had to have security before you could disarm. And within this issue of security also, a permanent occupation regime was decided for the Rhineland, semi-permanent anyhow. It was initially envisaged for 30 years, where the French, British, and Belgian forces would occupy parts of the Rhineland, which would make it impossible for Germany to mount another offensive westward. This, of course, was rolled up after in the early 1930s, when the last French troops left the French occupation zone of the Rhineland. But this was also not only a violation of the concept of self-determination, it was something that created permanent divisions within the international system because nobody could agree about it. And then in Eastern Europe, the thing to mention here, which is important, I think, in new ways the subject has been taught, is just to emphasize that this entire region from Latvia down to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia didn't really see an end to violence after the armistice was declared in 1918. There was a revolution in Germany, which was put down with pretty horrific violence. Parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, a Bolshevik regime was briefly established. There was fighting in Romania in these territories where they were in these areas where there were rival territorial claims. And also there was a war between Russia and Poland, which was a part of a wider civil war, which engulfed Russia in the aftermath of the revolution. The Allies, as you'll know, intervened in the Russian Revolution, but unsuccessfully, and the Poles intervened as well. And for a while, it looked as if the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Socialist Republic, would actually take Warsaw, and this was only prevented very narrowly. And in the end, a series of successor states emerged. Romania was enlarged. Hungary was hived off from Austria. Czechoslovakia was created. A new independent Poland was created, and a new state of Yugoslavia was what emerged along with independent Baltic republics. And Poland was given access to the sea, as you'll see from this. But this wasn't just a series of negotiations that happened in Paris. This whole area was engulfed in violence. And conceptually, something that I think doesn't come off all that clearly often is that these states were considered to be, on the one hand, a kind of cordon sanitaire in order to prevent the influx of the Bolshevik virus into the rest of Europe. So they were kind of a barrier against the Soviet Union, but they were also considered to be a barrier or a counterweight to German power. So they had this dual role that in some ways was a recipe for instability, because none of them were able to stand on their own, and none of them were able to agree very much with their other powers. And so I just want to talk briefly about the international politics of the 1930s, and in particular, the way in which European recovery was financed, particularly after 1924 with the Dawes Plan and finalized again in 1929 with the Young Plan. This is very important in some ways because American loans and investment in Germany drove Germany's ability to pay reparations to the European states and therefore to pacify European politics. And this then allowed the victorious powers, in particular France and Great Britain to a lesser extent, some of the others, Belgium and Italy, then to pay their war debts to the United States, because the United States refused to write off the enormous loans it had made to the various allied powers between 1914 and 1918. So this strange kind of cycle emerged where American loans drove German recovery and Germany's ability to pay reparations, which then led to enable the Allies to make good on their war debts to the United States. And the crucial thing to remember is that when American loans and investment dry up, the whole system seizes up. And this is one of the interesting aspects of the Great Depression that isn't widely understood, is that when the collapse happens in Wall Street, it has an immediate effect on these various payments, this payment cycle, which were very, very political. This is also the period of Locarno. And the one thing to remember about Locarno is a conference in October 1925. I've written quite a lot about this. And that is that in the Rhineland Pact, which was a four-power pact, Germany accepted the legitimacy of its new border with France with the return of Alsace and Lorraine and parts of the coal fields that lay in between on the Saar Basin. And these borders were then guaranteed by Great Britain and Italy. The frontiers in the east, however, Germany refused, despite enormous French pressure, to guarantee. In other words, the same guarantee wasn't extended across to Eastern Europe. And this meant that France had finally regained a British security guarantee, the guarantee that had allowed the Allies to fight successfully in the First World War, but it didn't have a clear military commitment in the event that Germany invaded France. And so for some scholars, and A.J.P. Tyler wrote this, of course he probably wrote the opposite as well, Locarno marked the end of the First World War and the spirit of Locarno, these statesmen meeting on this Swiss lake was a symbol of European progress and recovery, but it also was based on the understanding that European security was divisible and that you could have a different security regime in the East and much less stable and secure than you had in the West. And I think that's quite important. And this is why many historians have argued that in the end, 1920s were a decade of illusions, because Locarno didn't change the fundamental dynamics of the French worries about German revisionism or German revisionism. It left France and Britain, and still, and especially France, in a position of artificial predominance because of temporary German weakness. Germany had been limited at the Treaty of Versailles to a professional army of 100,000 soldiers, as well as no military air force and a very small fleet, totaling 100,000 tons in displacement altogether. Russia remained on the margins, and so did the United States politically, if not economically and financially. The United States didn't make any security commitments of the kind that were envisaged under Woodrow Wilson's government administration. Before all that, ended in failure when the United States didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles and therefore didn't join the League of Nations. In short, the international system in many ways didn't reflect underlying power balances, and but because there were I suppose limited opportunities for most of the powers, with the exception of Italy, I guess, to challenge the political order in Europe in the 1920s. These weaknesses were not exposed. And this is where I want to, I suppose, begin a serious discussion of the origins of appeasement and the war, and that is the seeds of the Second World War. Were they sown with the collapse on Wall Street? And Eric Hobsbawm, a very notable historian from the left of the political spectrum, wrote, "But for the world economic breakdown, there would certainly have been no Hitler. There would almost certainly have been no Roosevelt. It's extremely unlikely that the Soviet system would have been regarded as a serious economic rival and an alternative to world capitalism. In other words, Europe would have had a lot more stability." I'm not sure that there would have been no Hitler, no Roosevelt. That's impossible to prove. But what I want to emphasize is that this economic crisis was so important because it destabilized European domestic politics. And in doing that, it destabilized European foreign international relations ultimately as well, because it created conditions necessary for a virulently revisionist Nazi regime to come to power in Germany. And that's where I want to go to next. The revisionist challenge to this order that I've just described to you. You know, this is, I'm not going to read out these quotes to save time, but what I wanted to mention is what the Japanese, but especially the fascist and Nazi regimes, had in common was this concept of the nation as the central social and cultural category in all political life. In other words, you know, Hitler very famously, after the Battle of Stalingrad, reassured his generals, you know, what is an army? You know, what are the casualties that we've suffered? Okay, all that matters at the end is the German nation. Ultimately, the individual must die, but the nation marches on. And the nation for Hitler, the German nation, which is inextricably linked to concepts of race. The German nation was the German Volk, and it was really a national racial community, what the Germans called a Volksgemeinschaft. These categories were crucial. And more importantly, in some ways for international relations, in this conception, and Mussolini shared it, by the way, war was a necessary tool to achieve national greatness. There was no rise to greatness and fulfillment of national potential without war. War was, if you like, the chrysalis. It was the ultimate test of a nation's character. And it was at the very center of both fascist and Nazi conceptions of both national and international politics. The fascists were less successful in organizing Italian society in order to make war, but the Nazis took this very seriously, and they were successful in making preparations for war the fundamental aims of both domestic and foreign policy. And again, this conception, as I've said there, war is an inevitable and even desirable aim of all national policy. The first challenge to collective security, we don't have time to get into it, however, but these things are very connected, was, of course, Japan's aggression against China, the first major challenge, which left the League of Nations rather impotent, the rape of Nanking, and this only intensified Japanese nationalist rhetoric, and it, I think, in some ways accelerate a move towards a Rome-Berlin axis, because it helped the perception that the status quo powers were unwilling to take the difficult but maybe perhaps necessary decisions to use force or the threat of force to meet challenges to the post-war order. Now, initially, you wouldn't have thought that Mussolini was a natural ally for Hitler's Germany, because not the fascist regime considered itself to be a European power, and for it to maintain this status in many ways, the independence of Austria was crucial, because should Austria come under German domination, this would leave Italy vulnerable to strategically to a German offensive southward. But there were important ideological affinities that I've just described, and in some ways, these plus the fact that both states were status quo powers, I think, really really underpinned the gradual move of Italy towards acceptance of some kind of closer relationship with Germany. This wasn't automatic by any means. As late as mid to late 1935, Italy was still considering whether or not it should join a front against Nazi revisionism. However, it did have ambitions to, in some ways, I suppose, recreate the Roman Empire, to make the Mediterranean a Roman lake, and to settle scores with Abyssinia in particular. Abyssinia was the one power that had defeated a European African power to defeat a European power in the late 19th century. And this is Mussolini in March 1934. The historical objectives of Italy have two names: Asia and Africa. South and East are the compass points to which the interests and the will of the Italians are directed. Of all the great powers, the closest to Africa and Asia is Italy. Italy's position in the Mediterranean gives it the right and duty to accomplish this task. And this is the idea of making the Mediterranean an Italian lake, which was very important, was a motivating force for the fascist regime under Benito Mussolini. Nazi foreign policy has, I think, probably attracted more controversy than the foreign policy of fascist Italy. The foreign policy of fascist Italy, I suppose, is divided between historians that argue that Mussolini had all of these ambitions, but ultimately Italy was in a position to achieve them, and therefore it was difficult to say that a lot of this rhetoric wasn't mainly oriented towards a domestic Italian audience. And there are other historians, and probably Renzo de Felice, a famous Italian author, sympathetic to Mussolini in relative terms. This is his argument, whereas this is met by a counter argument by people like MacGregor Knox and Richard Bosworth and others, that even if Italy didn't have the means at its disposal, this doesn't mean that this wasn't a serious policy. And in fact, there's overwhelming evidence that it was. There are similar debates about Nazi foreign policy. How serious was the Nazi regime about making war the ultimate aim of its foreign policy? In general, I think most historians now would say that war was absolutely at the center of almost everything the Nazis tried to do in Germany, both domestically and internationally. I don't have time to go over this in much detail. There is, however, an interesting debate. There was an interesting debate between Tim Mason and Richard Overy back in the late 80s, early 90s, where Tim Mason argued that a growing economic crisis in Germany, because the Nazis had no idea how to organize a national economy, radicalized foreign policy, and as a result, forced the Nazi regime into war. Richard Overy and others argued no, war was the aim of Nazi policy all along. The Nazis didn't understand economics. All they cared about was putting the German economy at the service of a machine of war and conquest. And most recently, Adam Tooze has written a book called The Wages of Destruction that many of you may have heard of or read. And Tooze argues, he kind of splits the difference. He argues there was an economic crisis, but that doesn't mean that the Nazis weren't serious about organizing the entire nation for war. There are questions about continuity in German foreign policy, which I'm sure are not new to you. For me, and I think for a clear majority of historians, Hitler's ideas about race and the importance of races that were successful, were expansionist and dominating and sought space, was absolutely central to the Nazi regime's foreign policy aims. What were the final aims? Well, it's impossible to say. Certainly, conquest of living space in European Russia to get access to the foodstuffs and raw materials needed for a world policy. And then this is, I suppose, a run up to the war. So these are the events. These are something we don't have to spend a lot of time on, other than to mention these key moments in 1936, between 1936 and 39, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Spanish Civil War, which brought the fascist and Nazi regimes closer together. In March 1938, the Anschluss happened, where Germany basically occupied Austria, and this was ratified by a plebiscite which turned in 99.75% votes in favor by Austrian Germans of joining the Nazi Reich. This created the conditions toward the Sudetenland and Munich. Again, the Munich Agreement was the end result of a fevered series of negotiations between Germany and Great Britain initially, and ultimately Italy and France joined in. It ended up being the basic partitioning of Czechoslovakia, probably the most successful state created among the Eastern successor states after the Paris Peace Conference. And, in the aftermath of the Munich Conference, Chamberlain famously announced that it would be peace in our time. And this is important because one of the things that divides historians over Munich, and we're going to get to that right now in terms of Great Britain, was the extent to which Neville Chamberlain believed that it was possible to reach a durable understanding with Nazi Germany. And some historians argue that no, that Chamberlain was always fairly realistic about the ultimate threat posed by Nazi Germany. In fact, his appeasement policy should really be understood as playing for time. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of evidence in historians like Alistair Parker in particular, and David Dutton, who argue that no, it's clear that Chamberlain did make this fundamental mistake of assuming that it was possible to make a deal that would last with Nazi Germany. And so, to begin with, I suppose, in a discussion of appeasement, which is what we're supposed to be talking about today, it's important to emphasize that there is a long and distinguished tradition of appeasement in European international relations and in British foreign policy. Great Britain had resolved a series of crises, particularly in the lead up to the period between 1880 and the Boer War, by practicing a policy of appeasement. In the 1930s, its objectives were to contain Germany, and it was willing, as a result, to envisage a revision of the Treaty of Versailles to do so. At the same time, however, it did, and there's no doubt that under Chamberlain's government, Britain did begin to rearm very seriously, and there was a double policy of concessions to Germany made alongside a British rearmament program, particularly in the air, but also from mid-1938 on the ground as well. And the British Navy had begun a serious and ambitious program of refurbishment back in the early 1930s. And some of the key questions that we really need to address are, did Chamberlain have a choice? Were the policy constraints real that he was facing, an absolute, or was another policy, an alternative to appeasement, really a realistic possibility? And when considering all of these, we have to also take into account the political and the cultural environment of Europe and in Great Britain in the aftermath of the First World War. And this is brought out beautifully by a number of historians. Still, one of the best books on this is a book by Michael Howard. It's simply called The Continental Commitment. And that is this idea that Britain had accepted horrific sacrifices in terms of both its national treasure, but especially a generation of young men to establish a peace in Europe, and that this is something that Britain should not countenance again unless every other alternative had been tried. There was also a widespread sense that, so the memory of war, the legacy of the First World War is very important. There's also a widespread sense that the Nazi regime's demands were really a righting of some of the wrongs of Versailles in terms of, for example, that corridor to the sea given to Poland, which was populated by mainly German people, by people of German nationality, violation of the principle of self-determination. And so when the Nazi regime began to threaten Czechoslovakia after the Anschluss, there was a sense that this was a quarrel that was really about settling mistakes made in 1919 and not worth another war. This sentiment was very popular in France as well, very widespread in France. It has to be said, Labour members of Parliament had voted against rearmament for most of the 1930s until the Soviet Union had entered world politics in 1934 and endorsed rearmament. And there was widespread support for Chamberlain's policy of Munich within the British public, and which only began to dissipate in the aftermath of Munich. Chamberlain was aware also, and he was worried about the fact that rearmament could threaten economic stability. In 1937, a new economic downturn hit the British economy, rising unemployment. There was a fear that massive rearmament would ultimately undermine Britain's ability to act internationally with authority, because its economy would be weak, and also would threaten its ability to wage a total war in the long term. There's also, and this in fact affected both French and British policy, a widespread fear of Bolshevism. The perceived Soviet aim of world revolution, I'm sorry, I misspelled that there, was very important because the activities of the Comintern, the perception was that their ultimate aim, the Communist International created in March 1919, was to overthrow the international bourgeoisie and create a worldwide workers' republic. And this was considered to be by many the long-term fundamental aim of Soviet policy, even though from the moment the Soviet Union had joined the League of Nations in 1934, it had become a consistent champion of collective security right through until late 1938. Yet there was profound mistrust of Soviet motives and a deep reluctance to integrate the Soviet Union into an anti-Nazi, anti-revisionist front. Whether or not the Soviets were serious and would have accepted this role is a question historians still argue about, and there's really no consensus at all. What it is clear, however, is that the Soviets were not invited to the Munich conference, which settled the fate of Czechoslovakia, and fear of Bolshevism, anti-Bolshevism, was an important element in the policy of appeasement. Now, historiographically, and I'm wrapping up here quickly, there are three main schools of thought. There is, I suppose, the guilty men thesis, which was characterized during and after the Second World War, that appeasement was a corrupt policy by corrupt and incompetent politicians, a savage attack on the stupidity and cowardice of appeasement, really influenced not least by Winston Churchill and his consistent opposition to appeasement, and then his rise to power when it became clear that Neville Chamberlain's policy aims had failed during the Phoney War. Then there's the revisionist argument that appeasement actually bought time and that while Czechoslovakia was surrendered, you know, in the long run, this allowed both France and Britain to complete their rearmament programs and to take their states into war united. And that there were, and so this is Paul Schroeder's quotation from 1976. You can read it, but really appeasement was a sensible response to a strategic dilemma, given that there was no widespread support for war inside Britain or France, for that matter. And this is a view that became prominent once the archives were open, and it became clear some of the choices facing British policymakers, and the, you know, as expressed in a lot of the official records that emerged from the 1960s. Donald Cameron Watt was one of the leading voices. And really the argument here with the revisionists is that appeasement was almost an overdetermined policy. In other words, you know, as Paul Schroeder says, if you do a balance sheet of the pressures pushing policy elites in Great Britain towards appeasement, it's clear that they really didn't have a choice. Now, this has been challenged by, among others, Alistair Parker, RAC Parker, who tend to accept the apparent rationality of appeasement, but also argue that it was flawed. It was based on flawed assumptions. And the fundamental flawed assumption was that it was impossible to make a deal with the Nazi regime. And appeasement was based ultimately not on playing for time, but a fundamental misjudgment of the Nazi regime, and especially Hitler's personality and its objectives. And I suppose that's more or less where we are still with Great Britain. I would say probably there is no consensus. Sidney Astor argued in 1989 that there was an emerging kind of guilty men movement. I don't think that's the case. However, you know, I think it's impossible to dispute Alistair Parker's central claim that, you know, at the center of the policy of appeasement was a fundamentally flawed assessment of the nature and objectives of the Nazi regime. And so this is where we are. You know, was there an alternative to appeasement? I'm not sure. It's hard to say. French policy and appeasement, and I just don't want to go over this quickly, but it's sometimes lumped in with British policy. And all I want to emphasize here is that it was based on a very different set of strategic and political calculations. The economic depression arrived later in France and lingered longer, and it exacerbated in ways, in much more fundamental and radical ways, divisions between right and left in French politics, which were a legacy of and a consistent feature of French politics since the revolution. In France, it was the Popular Front, a left-wing coalition that emerged, that was elected in 1936, and included the French Communist Party, as well as Radical Socialist Party and the Socialist Party, the leadership by Léon Blum, led by Léon Blum. And it was this regime, this government, that actually began serious rearmament in France. And this is something that is not widely understood, particularly by British historians. But in France, in fact, it was the left that was much more firm in its response to Nazi Germany. However, the British were, the French were hamstrung by an absolute conviction, which was born out of bitter experience between 1914 and 1918, that France could not risk war with Germany without a clear guarantee of British support. And that was not a feature in the lead up to the Sudetenland crisis in 1938. And this has spawned some historians to argue that in France, in fact, French policy was ultimately made by the English governess, the gouvernante anglaise, as it's called. This is not the case. This is not true. But the French did follow along with British policy of the war in Spain. Edouard Daladier during the Czechoslovak crisis. There's some slides here. Ultimately, however, it's very clear to me, especially because I've written a lot about this, that France would have fought in 1938. However, it couldn't have done much to assist the Czechs in the short term, because its strategy was based on this concept of what they called a guerre de longue durée, a war of long duration, where France would start on the defensive with its British ally, marshal the resources of its empire, and then in the longer term, mount a strategic offensive against Germany. In the short term, however, especially after Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in March of 1936, it was impossible for France to mount a swift offensive to help the Czechs. However, France would clearly have fought in 1938 had the British had fought and had Germany invaded Czechoslovakia. The French did declare partial and general mobilization in 1938. The key question was, what would Britain do? Because the assumption was that France could not risk war without British support. And so I suppose I just wanted to just pose this question. What was appeasement? Appeasement was many things, but the fundamental point I'm trying to make here towards the end of this talk is that it was something very different for the British compared to France. In fact, for the French case, it was a response to internal divisions, but in particular, a strategic dilemma that France could not make war against Germany alone. For the British, it was something very different indeed. It was an attempt to establish a durable political settlement that would pacify Europe and enable Great Britain to stay out of any security commitments to Europe in the longer term. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I've gone on a little longer than I thought I would, but I'm happy to chat about these things with anybody either now, or if you want to get in touch with me either by email, or perhaps we could have a chat over a coffee sometime in the West End or somewhere else when things improve.